Many Muslims believe that not only did Jesus not die by crucifixion, but he was never even on the cross in the first place. Essentially, Muslims claim that God miraculously placed the appearance of Jesus upon another individual, such as Judas or Simon of Cyrene. This individual was crucified in Jesus' place while God brought Jesus up into heaven. The disciples understandably thought Jesus died and proclaimed this message throughout the world. This view centers around three main arguments. 1. Gnostic sources confirm this theory. 2. The Bible itself seems to confirm this theory. And 3. The crucifixion of Jesus is unnecessary. Muslims like to use the Gnostic Gospels as proof that Jesus did not die on the cross. Gnostic Christianity developed in the 2nd century and died out around the 4th century. The Gnostic Gospels teach that Jesus did not die on the cross, and some even say that Jesus' appearance was placed on another individual who died in his place. This proves that many of the early Christians believed in the substitution theory, and this would be a more common belief if Gnostic Christianity was not overshadowed by the Christianity that developed at the Council of Nicaea. However, Christians find the reference to Gnostic Gospels by Muslims to be hypocritical. For one, the Gnostic Gospels were written by polytheists who believed God to be an evil deity. The Gnostics believed all matter to be evil, and since Jesus was not evil, he could not have actually existed. This means that he could not have died. These individuals wrote counterfeit Gospels about Jesus to fit their strange theological views. Overall, the Gnostics were a small group of people who held theological views that both Muslims and Christians do not agree with. Their conclusions were not based on any evidence, but rather their belief that all matter is evil. This makes them unreliable sources to point to. Muslims also argue that even the Bible seems to confirm the substitution theory. Some Muslims quote Hebrews 5:7, which says, "During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission." This verse affirms that Jesus did not actually die, just as Muslims say. On top of this, Luke 24 contains a story of Jesus walking with his disciples after his apparent death, but they were unable to recognize him. His appearance was divinely hidden from his disciples, and only after their eyes were opened did they realize that this was Jesus. This at least opens the possibility that Jesus' appearance was changed in some capacity. It also seems likely that someone else was on the cross because Jesus said in Matthew 26 that he would not drink wine again until he drinks it with his disciples in his Father's kingdom. And yet the individual on the cross drank from wine as recorded in John 19:29. This could not have been Jesus on the cross. Muslims also wonder how anyone can trust the disciples' testimony about Jesus' death since none of them were present during the crucifixion. At best, their testimony is secondhand. This causes Muslims to believe that even the Bible supports the substitution theory. But Christians are not convinced by this argument. First off, the entire book of Hebrews centers around Jesus' death on the cross, so Muslims must ignore the context of Hebrews 5:7 in order to use it in their argument. Secondly, Jesus' appearance was hidden from his disciples, but this does not mean that his appearance was switched onto another person during the crucifixion. Just a few verses later in Luke 24, verse 26, and again in verse 46, Jesus told his disciples about his death. Muslims have to trust some verses that fit their argument while rejecting other verses in the very story they are quoting. Also, the argument that Jesus would not drink wine misunderstands what Jesus was referring to. Jesus was talking about the act of communion, which he just instituted with his disciples. He did not say he would not drink any wine, but rather the special wine of communion. Finally, the claim that none of the disciples were present during the crucifixion is false, since the disciple John was there. The substitution theory also fails to account for the widespread belief that Jesus rose from the dead. If Jesus was brought up to heaven instead of going to the cross, how did his disciples become convinced that they saw the risen Jesus after the crucifixion? If Jesus was still walking around after the crucifixion and he never died, why wouldn't he have clarified that he never died to his disciples? The substitution theory attempts to explain away the evidence for Jesus' death, but has no answers for the ample evidence for Jesus' resurrection, namely the disciples' sincere belief that they saw the risen Jesus after the crucifixion. Muslims also say there is no reason for God to have allowed Jesus to undergo so much pain and humiliation. It would make more sense that God placed someone deserving of punishment, such as Judas Iscariot, on the cross in the place of the innocent and godly Jesus. However, this argument completely misunderstands the central teaching of all of Christianity. Essentially, Christians believe that mankind fails to meet God's standards of perfection. Since God is holy and just, he must punish anyone who falls short of his perfect standards. Christians believe that everyone stands guilty before God with no hope of being saved by their own efforts. No amount of good deeds will cancel out the fact that we fall short of God's standards. While Muslims believe that ultimately God's mercy will supersede his holiness and justice, Christians believe that God cannot restrict any of his attributes instilled in God. Therefore, God would need to find a way to maintain his perfect holiness and justice while still being fully merciful and loving. The Christian solution is Jesus' death on the cross. Jesus willingly took the punishment that every person deserved upon himself. Now God has punished our sins while being able to extend his mercy to each and every one of us. All we have to do is accept this payment in our place and turn away from our sinful lifestyle in order for God to apply Jesus' payment to us. To say that Jesus' death on the cross was unnecessary completely misses the entire message of the Christian faith. After seeing the evidence for Jesus' crucifixion, along with possible theories that attempt to explain this evidence, we are left with a decision. Is the historical evidence correct in affirming that Jesus died on the cross? Or is the Quran correct in saying that it only appeared that he did? If we go with the historical evidence and conclude that Jesus did in fact die by crucifixion, we are left with a bigger decision to make. Was Jesus nothing more than one of thousands of crucifixion victims at the hands of the Romans? Or is he God in human flesh who died for the sins of all of humanity? If he is who he claimed to be, then we must decide if we will follow him or continue to live in our sin. If you want to learn more about Islam and support my channel, please consider checking out my book, A Visual Analysis of Islam. The link is in the description.